Standing my ground against a powerful homeowners association cost me more than just peace of mind. It nearly cost me my freedom. The moment the sheriff slapped handcuffs on my wrists for refusing to sell the only family farm standing between wealthy developers and their expansion plans, neither of us knew how quickly the tables would turn. What happens when corrupt officials try to arrest the wrong military family's son on his own land? I never expected at 40 years old that I'd be fighting to save my family's legacy. This land has been in the Harrison family for 3 generations, ever since my grandfather purchased these 40 acres after returning from World War II. The white farmhouse with the wraparound porch isn't just a house. It's where I grew up watching my father leave for military deployments, and where I decided to put down my own roots. My father took a different path than his father. Instead of farming, he pursued a military career that eventually led him to the Pentagon. Growing up, I saw him only during brief leaves between assignments. While he was commanding troops overseas, I was learning to tend crops and fix fences under my grandfather's watchful eye. When Grandpa passed 5 years ago, I left my construction job in the city and moved back to take over the farm. My father supported my decision, even though he probably hoped I'd follow him into military service. "Someone needs to keep the family land," was all he said when I told him my plans. Everything changed last spring when bulldozers appeared just beyond my property line. The Mountain Ridge Estates, they called it. Within months, massive homes with manicured lawns surrounded my farm on 3 sides. The contrast was jarring. My weathered barn and tractor parts against their stone facades and infinity pools. I first noticed the stairs when I'd drive my tractor along the shared road. The new neighbors would wrinkle their noses at the occasional farm smell or the dirt my tires left behind. I didn't think much of it then. Live and let live. That's always been my philosophy. Then the letters started arriving, first from the county, then from something called the Mountain Ridge Homeowners Association. Apparently, my property was now considered an area of concern. 5 years farming this land without issue, and suddenly, I'm a problem that needs solving. I should have seen the warning signs. The way county officials who'd known me for years suddenly couldn't look me in the eye at the general store. The whispers that stopped when I entered the diner in town. Something was happening behind the scenes, and I was the last to know that my little piece of America had become the final obstacle in someone else's grand plan. The black SUV kicked up dust as it rolled down my drive one Tuesday morning. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, looking completely out of place among my chicken coops and hay bales. He introduced himself as Robert Wilson, president of the Mountain Ridge HOA. His handshake was firm but cold. "Beautiful piece of history you have here," he said, though his eyes were assessing, not admiring. "I'm sure you're aware of the changes happening in this area." Wilson unfolded a large map across my kitchen table. The colorful rendering showed luxury homes, a community center, tennis courts, and a large swimming pool, all surrounding a conspicuously blank space in the shape of my farm. "We're creating the most exclusive community in the county," Wilson explained. "Property values have already doubled since we broke ground. The only issue is—" He pointed to my property on the map. "Your farm is becoming increasingly incompatible with the community aesthetic." I sipped my coffee, saying nothing. "The HOA board has authorized me to make you an offer," Wilson continued, sliding a document across the table. The number was substantial, but barely 60% of what developers were paying for similar acreage in the county. "This is considerably below market value," I pointed out. Wilson's smile tightened. "We're accounting for the costs of demolition and remediation. Your structures aren't up to code, and there are environmental concerns with the agricultural usage. My family has farmed this land for 3 generations. I said firmly. It's not for sale at any price. He seemed genuinely surprised. People like Wilson weren't used to hearing no. I understand sentimentality, he said condescendingly, but you're a practical man. You must see that progress is inevitable. This area is changing. Then it can change around me. Wilson's friendly facade cracked slightly. Mr. Harrison, I should mention that as this community develops, county ordinances regarding noise, smell, and appearance will be more strictly enforced. Farming is becoming impractical here. Those ordinances have exemptions for established agricultural properties, I countered. I've already checked. His eyebrows raised slightly, reassessing me. Well, regulations change. The county commission is very supportive of our development. Before leaving, Wilson placed his business card on the table. My offer stands for 30 days. After that, I can't guarantee the same terms. I hope you'll reconsider, for your own sake. As his SUV disappeared down my driveway, I found myself wondering if I should call my father. At 59, General James Harrison now commanded significant resources at the Pentagon. A single phone call from him could probably make this problem disappear. But I'd always been determined to solve my own problems. When I declined to enter the military academy at 18, choosing agriculture college instead, I'd promised myself I wouldn't rely on my father's position. This farm was my responsibility, not his. I tucked Wilson's card into my junk drawer and went back to repairing my irrigation system. Whatever game the HOA was playing, I wasn't about to forfeit my family's legacy without a fight. The next few weeks brought a steady escalation. First came the noise complaints when I started my tractor before 7 a.m., something I'd done for years without issue. Then the county animal control officer appeared, responding to anonymous concerns about my livestock's welfare. The HOA's tactics became increasingly transparent. Whenever I drove through the new development, security vehicles would follow me. Residents would pointedly hold their noses or cover their children's eyes, as if my pickup truck might contaminate them. Wilson returned 3 times, each visit with a slightly better offer and considerably more pressure. The board is getting impatient, he warned during his last visit. They've invested too much to let one stubborn farmer derail the community plan. The breaking point came when I discovered a connection I should have seen sooner. Sheriff Mike Carter, who'd recently been elected with substantial donations from local businesses, was Wilson's brother-in-law. More troublingly, Carter had purchased 3 lots in the new development at suspiciously below-market prices. I first noticed the sheriff's involvement when he personally responded to a noise complaint about my rooster. Standing in my barnyard in his pressed uniform, he seemed more concerned with surveying my property than addressing the complaint. "You know, Harrison," he said, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, "I've got friends asking why you're being so difficult. This development is good for the county. More tax revenue, better services." "My family has been paying taxes here for 70 years, I replied. "Never heard complaints before." The sheriff shrugged. "Times change. Young farmers like you need to change with them, or—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. After he left, my neighbor Ed Johnson came by. Ed's farm had been bought out the previous year. "Be careful, Tom," he warned. Before I sold, I had 3 health inspections, 4 building code violations, and a sudden issue with my water rights. Sheriff Carter delivered each notice personally. The pattern became clear when I received a certified letter citing agricultural runoff concerns that required expensive water quality testing. The environmental officer who came to collect samples wore a Mountain Ridge Estates cap. That evening, I caught teenagers from the development throwing rocks at my chickens. When I called the sheriff's office, the dispatcher informed me that, unfortunately, all deputies were busy with higher priority calls. I considered calling my father again that night. As a four-star general currently overseeing joint operations at the Pentagon, he had connections that could shut down this harassment with a single phone call. But our relationship had always been complicated. After my mother died when I was 12, he'd buried himself in his military career, while I stayed with my grandparents on the farm. We respected each other's choices, but rarely asked for help. Instead, I called a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. Her advice was sobering. They're building a paper trail to force you out. It's happening all over the county. Small farmers getting squeezed by developers with deep pockets and deeper political connections. As I hung up, I realized this wasn't just about my farm anymore. This was about whether money and influence could override generations of history and hard work. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for everyone who'd ever had something that someone more powerful wanted to take. Sheriff Carter's cruiser rolled down my driveway exactly 1 month after Wilson's first visit. I was splitting firewood when he arrived, and I didn't put down my axe immediately, a small act of defiance that didn't go unnoticed. "Morning, Harrison," he called, sunglasses reflecting my weathered barn. "Got a minute to talk?" I embedded the axe in the chopping block and wiped my hands. "Seems like you've made the time." The sheriff surveyed my property with exaggerated attention. "Noticed you've got quite a few situations developing here." Situations? Agricultural waste management violations, unpermitted structures, outdated electrical systems. He ticked each item off on his fingers. "The county's been lenient with you out of respect for your family's history here, but there are limits to what we can overlook." I matched his gaze. Funny how these situations only became issues after luxury homes started popping up. Carter removed his sunglasses, his expression hardening. "I've been authorized to give you one final opportunity to resolve this amicably. The HOA's offer has been increased by 10%. That's more than generous considering the remediation costs they'll incur." "Not interested," I said flatly. The sheriff sighed, as if genuinely disappointed. "Tom, we grew up together. This isn't personal. But the county commissioners have unanimously approved the rezoning of this entire area for residential development. Your agricultural exemptions expire at the end of the month." "That's not legal. I wasn't notified of any rezoning hearings." "Notices were published according to county requirements." His smile was thin. "Not our fault if you don't read the legal sections of newspapers." He handed me an official-looking document. "This is a preliminary assessment of the violations on your property. Conservative estimate for bringing everything up to code is just under $200,000. The number was deliberately impossible, more than the farm's entire annual income. "You've got 48 hours to accept the HOA's offer before I start writing citations," Carter said. "Each violation carries daily fines. At some point, those fines exceed property value, and the county forecloses." The threat hung in the air between us. This wasn't law enforcement. It was extortion wearing a badge. I considered mentioning my father then, letting slip that General James Harrison might take an interest in apparent corruption targeting his son. But I'd never used my father's position for personal advantage before, and I wasn't about to start now. "My grandfather once told me," I said instead, "that the measure of a community isn't how it treats its newest members, but how it respects its oldest traditions." Carter's face flushed. He knew who my father was, even if he'd underestimated my connection to him. "Your grandfather isn't here," he snapped, "and traditions change when they get in the way of progress. 2 days, Harrison. Then things get complicated." As his cruiser disappeared down my drive, I looked at the ultimatum in my hands. They had all the power, the law, the money, the connections. All I had was this land and a stubborn streak as deep as the soil beneath my feet. That, and one phone call I'd hoped I'd never have to make. The next morning, I discovered my fence cut in 3 places along the property line shared with the development. My cattle had wandered onto their perfectly landscaped common area, trampling flower beds and leaving distinctive patties on the walking path. Before I could round them all up, Wilson appeared with his phone out, documenting everything. "This is exactly the kind of irresponsible farming we've been concerned about," he announced loudly to the gathering residents. "Livestock roaming free, damaging private property." I didn't bother explaining about the cut fence. They wouldn't believe me anyway. That afternoon, Sheriff Carter returned with a deputy to investigate the livestock incident. He walked the property line, taking photos of what he called insufficient fencing and inadequate livestock management. "Mighty convenient timing," I observed. Carter ignored the comment. "I'll need to file an animal control report. If it happens again, your livestock will be impounded." After they left, I repaired the fence, using heavy chains where the wire had been cut. 3 hours later, my neighbor Ellie Baker called. "Tom, you need to know what's happening," she said in a hushed voice. "There's an emergency HOA meeting tonight about your farm. My husband's on the board. He said they're calling it a health and safety crisis." I thanked her for the warning, though I wasn't surprised. The playbook was becoming clear. Manufacture crises, document everything, build a paper trail, then use the legal system to force compliance. That evening, I drove past the development's clubhouse. Luxury cars filled the parking lot. Through the large windows, I could see Wilson standing at a podium, gesturing at enlarged photos of my farm projected on a screen. Sheriff Carter stood nearby, arms crossed, adding official weight to the proceedings. Back home, I began organizing decades of property records, permits, and tax documents. If this was headed where I suspected, I'd need evidence of my own. Just after midnight, I heard engines on my access road. Grabbing my flashlight, I caught 2 men in dark clothing tampering with my irrigation ditch. They fled when my light hit them, but the damage was done. They diverted water away from my fields toward the development's decorative pond. I didn't bother calling the sheriff. Instead, I set up game cameras at strategic points around my property. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd at least document the game. The next morning brought more concerned officials. This time, a county building inspector who cited my barn for violations that had never been issues during previous inspections. The environmental officer returned, taking soil samples from areas suspiciously close to where my cattle had been contained after the fence cutting. As I watched them leave, I finally made a decision I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about justice. My father had spent his entire career defending American rights and values. If anyone would understand the principle at stake here, it would be him. I pulled out my phone and found his private number. Not his Pentagon office, but the direct line he'd given me for emergencies. This wasn't how I wanted to reconnect with my father. But sometimes you need to recognize when you're outgunned and call for reinforcements. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. 3 days after the ultimatum, Sheriff Carter's cruiser roared down my driveway, lights flashing. 2 deputy vehicles followed close behind. This wasn't a visit. It was a show of force. I was repairing my tractor when they arrived. Carter strode toward me, hand resting on his holster, deputy flanking him on either side. "Thomas Harrison," he announced formally, "I have multiple warrants related to violations of county ordinances, environmental regulations, and animal welfare statutes." He held up a thick stack of papers. These include failure to maintain agricultural waste systems, unauthorized water diversion, improper livestock management, and operating unpermitted structures. This is harassment, and you know it, I said, wiping grease from my hands. I'm just enforcing the law, Carter replied, but his smirk told the real story. You had your chance to resolve this civilly. In the distance, I noticed Wilson and several HOA board members watching from luxury SUVs parked on the public road. They weren't even bothering to hide their involvement anymore. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Carter ordered. On my own property? For what? Having a farm in farm country? For violations that pose a threat to public safety and environmental health, he snapped. Now turn around, or I'll add resisting arrest. Pride made me want to refuse, but strategy suggested compliance, for now. I turned slowly, feeling cold metal close around my wrists, with a definitive click. This is what happens to people who don't understand progress, Carter muttered, tightening the cuffs an extra notch. The moment the handcuffs locked, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about justice, about standing against corruption wearing a badge and calling itself progress. You have no idea what you've just done, I said quietly. Carter spun me around roughly. What I've done is enforce the law against a stubborn farmer who doesn't know when he's beaten. My neighbors had begun to gather at the sound of the sirens. Some looked shocked, others satisfied. The community I'd known my entire life was divided, watching as I was marched toward the sheriff's car in handcuffs. The county's filing for emergency condemnation of this property, Carter announced loudly, playing to his audience. Environmental hazards, structural dangers. This place isn't fit for habitation. As he gripped my arm to guide me toward his cruiser, our confrontation reached exactly the moment captured in the photograph. Me shouting in protest, still handcuffed, while the sheriff restrained me in my own driveway. My white farmhouse and his patrol car forming the backdrop to this perversion of justice. What Sheriff Carter couldn't have known was that I'd finally made that phone call the night before. The one call I'd hoped I'd never need to make. I'd spoken directly to my father, General James Harrison, explaining everything that had happened. His response had been characteristically brief. I'll handle it. And while Carter was putting on his show of force, certain wheels had already begun turning in places far beyond his jurisdiction or imagination. The county jail was 20 miles away. Sheriff Carter drove personally, lecturing me the entire journey about respecting authority and the changing times. I remained silent, watching familiar countryside roll past the window, possibly for the last time. At the jail, Carter paraded me through the front entrance rather than using the prisoner intake, another performance for the small crowd of onlookers who'd somehow been tipped off about my arrest. You get one phone call, he announced loudly at the booking desk. Choose wisely. I nodded, maintaining my silence. They hadn't searched me thoroughly, hadn't found the small card I kept in my wallet for emergencies, a direct line I'd never used before last night. When finally allowed my call, I dialed the number from memory. Office of General Harrison, a crisp voice answered. This is Thomas Harrison. I need to speak with my father immediately. He's expecting my call. There was a pause. Verification code? Blue Oak, 1983. My birth year, and the tree where my father had carved his initials as a boy. Within seconds, my father's commanding voice came on the line. Thomas. They went through with it? Yes, sir. I've been arrested. I'm at the county jail now. I kept my voice low, aware of the deputy hovering nearby. Put the sheriff on, my father said. his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had directed military operations across 3 continents. "He wants to speak with you," I told the deputy, who looked confused but fetched Carter anyway. The sheriff took the phone with a smirk. "This is Sheriff Michael Carter." I couldn't hear my father's words, but I watched Carter's expression transform from smugness to confusion to something approaching alarm. "Sir, I understand your concern, but this is a local matter of—" Carter was cut off mid-sentence. His face paled slightly. "No, sir. I wasn't aware of your son's status under—" Another long pause as my father apparently educated the sheriff on certain federal protections extended to families of senior military personnel. "The warrants are properly filed through county—" Carter's protest died as he listened further. "I see. Yes, sir. I understand." When he finally handed the phone back, his confident demeanor had vanished. "Your processing will be delayed, pending review of the warrants," he informed me stiffly. 20 minutes later, a black government SUV with military plates pulled up outside. 2 men in civilian clothes with military bearing entered, presented credentials that made the booking officer stand straighter, and requested my immediate release. "There appears to be a jurisdictional question," the older of the 2 explained to Carter. "Mr. Harrison is being released into our custody while the matter is reviewed." As my handcuffs were removed, one of the men whispered, "Colonel Davis, JAG Corps. The general sends his regards and says to tell you reinforcements are inbound." Walking out of the jail, past a stunned Sheriff Carter, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride had kept me from involving my father earlier, but seeing the immediate response to his intervention, I realized sometimes family connections aren't just about privilege. They're about balancing the scales when justice has been corrupted. The 2 men from the SUV introduced themselves as Colonel James Reeves and Major Anthony Davis from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, military lawyers specializing in jurisdictional disputes. They'd flown in from Washington at my father's direct request. "General Harrison briefed us on the situation," Colonel Reeves explained as we drove back to my farm. "What you're describing, collusion between local officials and private developers, potentially violates federal statutes regarding the property rights of military families." I didn't want to involve my father, I admitted. He's got more important concerns than a farm dispute. Major Davis glanced back from the driver's seat. "The general specifically mentioned you might say that. He also said to remind you that the Harrison family has defended American soil for 3 generations, starting with this particular piece of it." When we arrived at my farm, we found Sheriff Carter and 2 deputies conducting what they called an inventory of my property. They froze when our vehicle pulled up. Colonel Reeves approached with brisk military efficiency, presenting documentation that made Carter's face tighten. "This property is now under federal jurisdiction, pending investigation of civil rights violations and abuse of authority," Reeves announced. "Your department is to cease all actions against Mr. Harrison and his property immediately." "This is county business," Carter protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is now the business of the Department of Defense," Reeves corrected. "General Harrison has initiated a formal inquiry into potential targeting of a military family member." While they argued jurisdiction, Major Davis quietly installed small cameras at strategic points around my property. "Standard procedure," he explained. "We'll have satellite surveillance within the hour." By evening, word had spread throughout the county. Curious neighbors drove slowly past, witnessing the uncomfortable sight of federal officers documenting evidence on my land, while Sheriff Carter's cruiser retreated down the road. My phone rang constantly, first local reporters, then state news outlets. I declined all interviews per Colonel Reeves's advice. This isn't just about your farm anymore, he explained. The general has uncovered concerning patterns of similar actions against other rural property owners. Your case might be the key to exposing systemic corruption. Just after sunset, a helicopter circled low over the property, its distinctive military profile unmistakable. It wasn't necessary for any practical purpose. It was a message to Sheriff Carter and the HOA that they'd picked a fight with the wrong family. That night, I received a direct call from my father. Despite our sometimes distant relationship, his voice carried genuine concern. "You should have called me sooner, Thomas," he said without preamble. "I wanted to handle it myself," I replied. "It's my responsibility." "It's our family's land," he corrected me, "and corruption is everybody's problem. I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing it because it's right." There was a pause before he added, "I'll be there tomorrow. We'll face this together." As I hung up, I realized something important had shifted. The land had always connected my father and me across our different choices in life. Now, perhaps, defending it would bring us closer in a way military service or farming alone never could. The county courthouse was standing room only by the time I arrived with Colonel Reeves and Major Davis. Local farmers filled the back rows. HOA members clustered near the front, whispering nervously among themselves. Sheriff Carter sat stone-faced beside county attorneys, having returned abruptly from his leave. Robert Wilson entered last, flanked by corporate lawyers. His confident stride faltered slightly when he saw the military officers accompanying me. The county commissioner called the emergency session to order, explaining it had been convened to address concerns about agricultural zoning enforcement. His forced smile couldn't hide his discomfort. Sheriff Carter presented first, describing my farm as a public health concern, requiring standard enforcement action. He carefully avoided mentioning his connections to the HOA or the timing of the enforcement. Wilson followed, showing carefully selected photos of my property that emphasized equipment storage and weathered buildings rather than productive fields and well-maintained livestock areas. He spoke of community standards and property values while avoiding any mention of their expansion plans. When my turn came, I simply stood and yielded my time to my representative. The courthouse doors opened. A hush fell over the room as my father entered. At 59, General James Harrison commanded attention without effort. His dress uniform displayed rows of decorations earned across decades of service. 4 stars gleamed on each shoulder. He walked purposefully to the podium, surveying the room with the calm assessment of a man who had commanded thousands in conflict zones worldwide. "My name is General James Harrison," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly throughout the room. "I'm here concerning the apparent targeting of my son's property through coordinated action between county officials and private developers." He nodded to Major Davis, who distributed folders to the commissioners. These documents detail violations of due process, conflicts of interest, and potential criminal conspiracy. They have been simultaneously provided to the state attorney general and federal authorities. My father then methodically presented the evidence: emails between Wilson and Sheriff Carter, the suspicious timing of inspections, comparative analysis showing my farm had been uniquely targeted despite similar conditions on other properties. "In my 35 years of military service," he continued, "I defended American values at home and abroad. Among those values is the right to own property without fear of corrupt officials using their power for private gain." Sheriff Carter shifted uncomfortably. Wilson stared at the table. "This is not merely about one farm," my father concluded. "This is about accountability, integrity, and the rule of law. If local officials can target one property owner through coordinated harassment, no one's rights are secure." He turned toward me, and for a brief moment, I saw something rarely displayed in my taciturn father's expression: pride. My son chose to continue our family's agricultural legacy while I pursued military service. Both paths serve this nation. Both deserve respect. He faced the commissioners again. I expect immediate cessation of all actions against this property and a full investigation into the conduct of both the sheriff's department and the county commission's rezoning processes. The silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath was immediate and dramatic. The county commissioners, visibly shaken by the federal attention, voted unanimously to suspend all enforcement actions against my property pending a comprehensive review. Sheriff Carter attempted to defend himself, claiming he was simply following standard procedures. My father cut him off with a single question: "Then you won't mind explaining those procedures to the FBI agents waiting outside?" Wilson tried a different approach, suggesting a community compromise that would allow my farm to continue operating under special exemptions while the HOA maintained its aesthetic standards. The desperation in his voice was evident. Developers who'd purchased lots based on promises of my land's incorporation were demanding answers. As the meeting concluded, reporters swarmed around us. Colonel Reeves efficiently managed the press, stating only that a potential abuse of authority is being investigated at multiple levels. Walking out of the courthouse, I found myself side by side with my father for the first time in years. Despite our different paths, we shared the same determined stride, the same set to our jaw. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded once. Family land is worth fighting for. Over the next week, the carefully constructed pressure campaign collapsed entirely. The environmental violations were mysteriously reassessed and found to be within acceptable parameters. The animal control concerns were withdrawn. The rezoning decision was reversed in an emergency session that lasted barely 15 minutes. Sheriff Carter submitted his resignation after state investigators opened an ethics inquiry into his relationship with the HOA. Wilson disappeared from public view as the development company distanced itself from the scandal. 3 months later, federal authorities announced broader investigations into similar cases across 5 states, using evidence from my situation as a foundation. New legislation was introduced to protect established agricultural properties from development pressure tactics. The most meaningful change came in my own community. Neighbors who had watched my arrest in silence now stopped to chat at the feed store or offer help during harvest. The division between old and new residents began to heal.